Grammar Girl here. I'm Mignon Fogarty, and today I'm here with Alex Temblador, who's a mixed Latine award winning author of the novel Half Outlaw. And the book we'll talk about today, Writing Identity Not Your Own, a guide for creative writers. She has an MFA in creative writing and does extensive teaching on creative writing, both at universities and in the broader literary world. Alex, welcome to the Grammar Girl podcast.
Thank you for having me. I'm so glad to be here to chat with you.
Yeah, this is such an interesting book. Writing an Identity, Not Your Own, the twin books. It's a
There we
great
go.
book. And,
Thank you.
I've never really seen anything like it before. And it's such a big question, I think, among fiction writers. Writers have heard you want more diversity in your book because it reflects the real world. And people should see themselves reflected in fiction. But then I've also seen people, absolutely skewered for getting it wrong, and it creates all this anxiety. And I feel like your book is really right for this moment where those discussions are happening. Can you tell me how the book came to be?
Yeah. So, because these conversations are happening, we had a really big one in 2020 with American Dirt when that came out. And the pandemic hit soon afterwards. So I feel like the conversation got a little bit stunted because we had a lot of things to be concerned with in the world. Um, However, it had that conversation had been happening for many years prior to that. And I was being asked by a writing workshops company called writingworkshops.com if I would teach a class on this subject. And I myself had kind of come across it within my own writing. I considered it a lot, starting out when I was in grad school up until like, especially with my second book. Um, and I was like, yeah, okay, I'll try this. Let me see if I can do this. What does it involve? When I was doing all the research, I also found that there was not a lot of information about it. And those information that was out there, like Nisi Shaw and Cynthia Ward created a great book, Writing the Other, I believe it was called, but that had been published so many years before and it hadn't been updated and it wasn't as thorough as I would have liked. Just to have more information. There were some websites that weren't being taken care of or like updated consistently anymore because it was a big job to update those websites. So I taught the class, got a lot of feedback from people who were as concerned about this subject and this topic and what should they do. And they were asking, what can I read after this class? Where can I go after this class to get more information? And there just wasn't anything I could point them to that covered a lot of the subjects about different identities. Maybe it was like one book about race or one book about sexual orientation, but it wasn't covering a lot of the different identities. So a few years later, after teaching it for teaching it many times with different organizations or universities, etc., I approached my agent because I couldn't get this question out of my mind of how do we do this? Like, where do we, how do we approach this? I would go to events and no one would want to talk about it on stage. They were very concerned if they got questions and they would shut down those questions very quickly. And I'm a very practical person of like, yes, I know this is complicated, but maybe there's a way we can figure this out. Maybe I can gather information from all these fantastic writers and people who had so much to say on the subject in one place. And then we can continue to have this conversation and develop it and see where this writing process takes us.
Yeah. I mean, when I hear these conversations, I find myself even wondering if people should try.
Yeah.
It's are we if we do that, are we making the world a better place by bringing, all different kinds of people into our stories, or are we just stealing other people's stories, things that other people should be writing instead? Like what is your thinking on that?
Yeah, that's a good conversation starter with this entire process. My perspective is we've been writing other identities. Like we always have. And we've written other historically marginalized identities, especially women. And we have not always done it in ways that are reflective or considering, um, are we putting out stereotypes about women? Are we continuing these harmful tropes, et cetera? So we've been doing that. And yes, as our world continues to really understand the importance of diversity, I think this question kind of comes up. And I do think we're getting this messaging that our stories need to have diversity because that reflects our world. But ironically, publishing still doesn't actually publish that many stories with historically marginalized representation. So it's kind of confusing there. Um, I don't necessarily think we need to be writing quote unquote diverse stories just because we think that's what publishing wants or we think that's how we're reflecting our society. In reality, most people actually don't have a very diverse group of friends. I have an exercise in the book where I have you reflect on who your closest like circle is. I think it's called the circle of trust in the book. And if you actually do the um, do the exercise, they have found that people really don't have as much diversity within their close group of friends. So it's interesting to me when they want to write, a very diverse set of a cast of characters. I question sometimes, well, how do you how do you know those characters? Like, how have you connected with that community in real life, or researched it, or learned about that community to really write it as thoroughly as I think you can? I really do believe writers have this capability, um, but it's I mean it's very complex as we're getting into it. But I don't think there's anything wrong with trying to write other identities that you don't inhabit or have not experienced or are two steps away from you. Um, there's nothing wrong with trying to write something. I don't think you're stealing stories. I think publishing needs to make space for historically marginalized people to write their own stories and share their own work.
Yeah, and you go through in the book you do, you have great exercises at the end of every chapter. There are these exercises that writers can do, and those were really helpful. And one thing that struck me is just it's I mean, it's a lot of obviously, but it's a lot of work to try to get this
Mhm.
right. You can't just take a character, who might have been white and say, "Oh, I'll just make them black, and then I have diversity in my story." So, talk about some of the ways that you can make your characters, authentic and real.
Definitely. I'm so glad you said we cannot just take one identity and replace it with the other. That's like number one big no-no. I think my favorite way to approach it is with intersectionality. And so it's really considering if I have a person, what identities does that person inhabit? Now, they're going to have things like a class identity, but in terms of how they grew up, or now that they're an adult, what kind of job do they have? What kind of income? But we also have identity in terms of their race and their sexual orientation and their gender identity, their nationality. Um, all of these things is going to make a person and a character completely different from a different person or character. Um, and that is going to impact how they speak throughout the book. It's going to impact their motivations, their fears, their concerns, their joys. And all of those little identities really are going to like randomly push the plot and it's going to impact how they interact with their setting. Um, so I think it is requiring writers to kind of sit back and think about story and character creation and plot in ways that I think we just naturally do instinctively. I don't know if we necessarily break down our characters in that manner all the time. And I'd like to challenge writers to kind of do that.
Yeah. Yeah. So what are the ways that a writer can, let's say it's true, a writer has a very like homogeneous social circle, but wants
Mhm.
to like give it a go, putting more diversity in a book. What are some of the places or ways that they can like learn more about? I mean, I don't know. I feel like it sounds dumb, but like, how can you learn more about people who aren't like yourself? Like, what are the ways that you have found work for, your writing students maybe who wanted to try something like this?
Absolutely. It's kind of like a three-pronged process that I like to think of. First of all, read books by people who are writing within their own identity. And not just that, but supporting them outside of the book. So supporting them on social media, reading their interviews, kind of seeing how they're talking about their work, why it's impactful for them to share these stories. That's just the start. But the second step, do your research, look into the different elements of an identity um, that people experience and inhabit and interact with. So that means you want to look at their history within a certain area or time. If you're talking about let's say Latino people in Texas, that's going to be different than Latino people in Chicago in the 1950s. Like, so, really study the history and the time, look at what was going on socially, culturally, understand those nuanced aspects that you're not going to be able to get from watching a movie or a TV show, or maybe even necessarily in all the books that you might read, because there's so much information out there, right? This seems
Mhm.
like a very big task, but it'll help you out a lot. I also suggest listening to podcasts by people of those identities, understanding how they speak and the different dialects, and how they might approach and have different perspectives. It's not, just a single perspective within a single identity. And then most of all, and this is probably the hardest one that I get a lot of writers pushing back on, and understandably so, is connecting with the community that you want to write about. So if you are more connected to that community, you know what's at stake if something is misportrayed in your work, if you write a stereotype, if you include something that's harmful. It also allows you to integrate the community and support them in different ways, and learn about those little things that you would not be able to get from research at times. Um, but I also think it's just a way. There's a really phenomenal children's book illustrator who said, I think it's James Ransom, who said he hadn't written about Native American, like he hadn't illustrated Native American picture books because he hadn't held their babies, which is
Mhm.
like this beautiful way of saying you want the community to trust you with their story. And they'll trust you if you're connecting with them and you're advocating for them and you're being their allies and accomplices, and really genuinely connecting with them.
Yeah, yeah, and you can't just do an internet search, like, you're not gonna
No.
get there. You mentioned in your book the Fuchi face, which is,
Yeah.
something a Latin American word name for, like, kids making, like, a face when something's disgusting or they don't like it, and so I wanted to see pictures, I wanted to learn more about it, and so I went and I did a Google search, and maybe this is just AI, but the AI result at the top was completely wrong. It
Oh
said,
no.
it was ridiculous. It said, "It's the face you make when your bathroom remodel doesn't go the way you want it to." And I
Oh.
was like, "What?" And there was an Instagram post that someone had, like, said that, and of
Uh-huh.
all the 9 other search results seemed right, but they picked on that one. So, and there's a lot of minefields if you're just limiting your search to one way of finding information and talking to people, and then it made me think of a guest I had on earlier in the year. She talked about how one person isn't representative of an entire community, so
Mhm.
even if you talk to one person, you're not getting the whole big picture.
No, not at all. Oh my gosh. I'm so glad you brought that up about just a little Google search. Yeah, we definitely need to check our resources, or check our sources to make sure they're providing the right information. But if you're part of the Latin A community, you'll just know that it's in memes that people send to each other, and people will point it out to children. I mean, I used to make that face all the time as a child. That's so funny that you brought that up.
It was a great example. So you mentioned stereotypes, and I have to say I got kind of overwhelmed going through that section in the book. But there's pages and pages of stereotypes and tropes that are problematic. But as I was going through it, it felt like I was marching through a list of every piece of popular fiction and every movie I'd ever seen. And so, like, the stereo and I have not written fiction, but I've experimented with it, and I've always felt like, "Oh, I can't write this because it's a cliche, and I can't write that because it's a
Mhm.
cliche," and my husband always makes fun of me because he's like, "Everything is a cliche." People like tropes and, the happy ending and romance and things like that. So, can you talk about, stereotypes and tropes? Like, they are definitely in fiction, and they're there for a reason, but then they can be done so badly. And so, like, what purpose do they serve? Why do we like them so much? And then what
Mhm.
can we do to still maybe use them, but in ways that aren't problematic?
Absolutely. So listeners, I have a whole chapter 11. It is the longest chapter in the book. It was very long for me to write. And I understand it is going to be overwhelming to read that chapter, and I apologize. But my mindset
Mhm.
when I was writing it was, okay, if I'm editing something that I've written, I want to be able to go to the section about um, sexual orientation and just like see and skim through the sexual orientation stereotypes to make sure I don't have anything in there that might be harmful. Now, when it comes to stereotypes and tropes, where they become harmful is when we reduce characters to like a single dimension or a single story, which Chimamanda Ngozi Adichie kind of coined that beautiful term. And it's when, you know, say for example, we have a character who is like gay and they are the gay best friend of your main character. Now, the gay best friend trope, we see it all the time, like in stories and in movies. And it is okay to have a gay best friend to a main character, but it becomes a trope when that character's sole purpose is only to help the main character. They have nothing beyond like surface level description of who they are. Um, who is that person intersectionally? Um, do they, what do they feel about things? Do they push against the main character instead of helping them? Um, in just a yes way. Do they give them different perspectives, their own perspectives? Do we as the reader get to see something that we wouldn't necessarily see if it was just tropic and they were only written in a single dimensional way? So I think you can have stereotypes and tropes, and you're going to see some of the things that I do list as stereotypes and tropes in your favorite books, movies, even in your own work. There's so many different ways you can use them. You can actually use stereotypes to like criticize the stereotype. So like the white savior stereotype or white savior's trope. Barbara Kingsolver has oh gosh, I'm blanking on the name of the book right now. But
That's
it's white
okay.
missionaries go to Africa saving souls and, which in itself is a whole white savior trope. But I think she criticizes a lot of that concept of white saviorism and that can sometimes be intermingled with religious saviorism. So I think there's ways to use it and use stereotypes mindfully, knowing here's how they have harmed stories in the past. I can use it to subvert the trope. I can use it in a new way. If we always have like these romance stereotypes, we've only always seen it with heterosexual characters. Maybe there's a way to use it to showcase queer characters, but not to the detriment of queer people, if that makes sense.
Mhm. Yeah, as I'm thinking about, I love stories that have really interesting secondary cast of characters. Like I love stories where the supporting characters are also just quirky and interesting and fun, and they have their own stories too. And it almost seems like, if you apply this to any kind of writing, it's going to make your writing better. Like your best friend, whether they're gay or straight or black or white or Asian or Latina, if you develop them more as a character, your stories are gonna be more interesting.
Absolutely. Yeah. And I know this is such a hard process to write other identities and edit other identities, but really, I hope it just helps you in every aspect of your writing process. Because a lot of times in this book, I'll tell you, okay, if something, feels kind of weird and awkward, or like you're not sure, am I being discriminatory there, or is this a harmful trope? Just write a whole other scene or delve deeper into that character. Maybe you're missing something about their intersectional identity that can come out there and really make them more complex, affect the storyline in some different way that's, uh, beneficial and positive, showcase a certain identity in a way that we don't necessarily see all the time. So I'm hoping it actually opens doors for you rather than shuts doors in the way that I think people could approach this process thinking, well, I'm not going to be able to do anything. Well, actually, it's a limiting mindset. This could give you an opportunity to do way more than you ever considered.
Yeah, yeah, and, as you were talking about, when you in the section where you talk about describing how people look and not doing that in a
Mhm.
problematic way, like, have you described your white characters? Like, how are you like, compare, like, if you're describing your characters of other identities way more than you're describing your white characters, that's a sign that something is happening. Like, talk more about that, please.
Yes. So there's sometimes an imbalance when we're talking about characters of different identities or we're describing them. Not only does it happen with how we describe looks with our characters of color, but it also, and usually it happens with dialogue too. So we might really focus on characters of different nationalities or different races and ethnicities. We'll focus on their accent and how they speak more so than, um, maybe white characters. I'm mixed. I'm half Mexican, half white. I have a Mexican side and I have a white family. And I'll go to both sides and I can tell you everybody uses like double negatives and drops articles and they don't speak quote unquote proper English or whatever it may be, even though we're all English speakers. That's all of our first language. So it's ironic that sometimes that can appear in our work where we will just naturally write white characters as if they're mainstream or as if we expect readers to just like know that's what we're intending, but then we'll go overboard sometimes describing characters of historically marginalized identities too much so, and then it can either exoticize those characters or make them into a caricature and still sends the message that white, straight, cis, heterosexual, able characters are the norm or the mainstream or etc. Yeah.
Yeah, like, leave things to the imagination for your readers or for everyone or, like, the same, like, yeah.
Yes.
And what about body language? That was an interesting section, tell me how to deal with body language.
Yes. Oh, I'm so glad you brought that up because as a writer myself, I write a lot of first person, and so I had to think of ways to not just like tell the reader everything that's going on in the mind, um, but also to think about like how do I perceive a situation happening based on what I'm observing about another person in a scene or in real life. And so with body language, when you're writing other identities, body language can tell you a lot, especially when you have characters of different identities interacting. Um, if somebody is very uncomfortable about discussing race, we see that in real life, people, closing themselves off or stuttering or looking down or looking for ways to run out the room. Um, it, so that's never going to happen with your characters if you're having a cast of characters who are different identities. Sometimes it can tell you more about what somebody doesn't recognize if they do something discriminatory to one character. It can also showcase how a character is really unsure what just happened. If they are, if they're crossing their arms, they're very uncomfortable, or they could be angry. If they're doing a little twitch, like pulling their hair back behind their ear, that might be indicative that something isn't right. Um, so, look at ways to bring in facial expressions, body movement, rather than just like relying on dialogue, which when we're writing other historically marginalized characters, as I said, we can rely too heavily on sometimes, rather than focusing on the way they look or their internal dialogue and their internal monologue. So I hope that kind of is like intersectionality and just like creates a more holistic, fully formed, well-rounded character for writers.
Yeah, and if you're wanting to do research, I imagine, it would probably be better to watch YouTube videos or something than to watch movies because movies might be stereotyping or at least might not be accurate.
Yeah, yeah. And if you do watch movies or film or TV, I would highly suggest like looking at who produced it, who wrote it, who's acting in it, to like see those levels of comfort that the actors might have and really showcasing like authentic characters and how they move. But yeah, I think YouTube, and again, just knowing people in real life and going and connecting with them in their safe spaces and in their communities and recognizing when they're comfortable around you. Because if you are a writer, I don't want to send this message like, oh, you want to write a different ethnicity, go like connect to the community and doing it for wrong reasons, right? You want to go in there genuinely, you want to go in there authentically. Um, there will or there could come a point where they feel comfortable enough to really be a little bit more of themselves with somebody who is not within the community, that you might start to see body language or word choice or behavior changing. And that's called code switching, because they usually have to, people of historically marginalized identities usually have to code switch in spaces that are not made for them or designed to be welcoming of them. And so if you are trying to connect into a community, that's something you're probably going to notice or recognize, or I hope you do eventually.
Yeah, and that's something that's gonna take a lot of time. You're not gonna show up and be like, "Hi, I'm writing a book about your community. Can I be your friend?" You know,
Yeah,
like that.
no. This is like a genuine give and get. And this is not like, I think some writers also think, well, I'm friends with the person at my religious institution, or my coworker is this identity. So, and we're friends. We see each other every day. Well, like, are you getting invited to the barbecues and the dinners and the funerals? Like, are they really opening up to you and showing you things or sharing things about their community that they might not do if they don't feel safe around you? So, really kind of understanding where you're at in that position and why you're there. And ultimately, it's more important to be there, supportive and as like a genuine friend. Yeah.
Yeah. I wanna talk about slang and dialect a little bit more because I think the language aspects are gonna be particularly interesting to Grammar Girl listeners. And, I think there's been some debate about how much slang and dialect you should use in fiction in general. So, because it can become dated and or
Mhm.
misrepresent people and things like that. So can you talk about sort of from a writing an identity not your own perspective, like what are the extra things you have to consider about slang and dialect?
Yeah. I think you need to, of course, make sure it's relevant to the time period in which you're talking about. Make sure you understand um, the different meanings behind different forms of slang. If it's used between people of the same community or people or only in relation to people outside the community. Um, Knowing kind of like the historical, cultural, and social aspects of that slang, that colloquialism, that phrase. I'm not really concerned with the idea of slang or colloquialisms being dated if you want to include it in your work. I think everything is dated as soon as it gets published. I mean, um, so I find it, could just bring something to life about a certain community or a time or a place that I think we in the publishing world should be promoting. Unfortunately, I do think publishing has pushed against slang colloquialisms among writers of historically marginalized identities, and I think that's to their detriment. Um, but also making sure that it doesn't become so caricature, like you don't overly use slang and colloquialisms from for your character of historically marginalized identity compared to somebody who is not marginalized or who has more privilege, so that there is that balance. Because sometimes it could come across as you are indicating that somebody at a certain identity is less educated or um, has broken English, which or is less than some other group, or is an out group, a person from an out group versus this in group that you're writing about. So, being with taking take consideration into all the elements that comes with slang and colloquialism, and how you present it with your character and how readers might perceive it is what I would suggest.
Yeah. The example I always think of is, we all, almost all of us at least, say gonna and
Yeah,
kinda. And if you only have some of your characters, it's spelled that way in their dialogue and not others, that why are you doing that? Is that really what you're trying to do? Doesn't usually make sense.
absolutely. And with like little aspects of dialect, like dialect there, like kinda or gonna, um, most of the time I would just say it's okay just to write it completely as kind of like in the grammatical way. Now, if you're like really trying to showcase maybe characters, accent, like I do have characters in my second book who um might have like a little country aspect to them, and that really kind of gets played up a little bit more than maybe some other characters. But it's and this kind of comes up when we're talking about characters of other nationalities is this question of, well, if they're learning English, shouldn't that show that their English is not like perfect, or their English or their grammar isn't perfect? And again, you could risk the situation of othering if you overdo it, if you do it in a way that is a caricature, if you do it in a way, um, if you do it without actually having this fully formed character that is complex and not solely defined by the language that they use.
Mhm. Yeah. So I listened to another interview you did, and you talked about your book Half Outlaw and how you wrote it, and then it seemed like you had done a lot more work on the writing an identity not your own, and then you went back and edited it. And I'd love to hear more about that editing process you went through yourself to implement some of these tactics that or insights that you gained about that kind of writing.
Yes. Oh, it was so scary to edit that book. So,
I
we'd
guess maybe
already
first
sold
give
it.
people a little overview of what it is too.
Yes. So, Half Outlaw is a story about a woman named Rocky who is half Mexican, half white. She's orphaned at a very young age and sent to live with her white uncle, who is part of a one percenter motorcycle club. So think like Hell's Angels types. And part of the book is she goes on a journey throughout the U.S. after her uncle dies and meets all these different people from who have different identities, who are queer, who are indigenous, who are um, Vietnamese, who are different levels of education, uh, different job backgrounds, classes, all these different identities are in this story, um, or even disabilities. And so I read the book. I felt pretty confident about it because I've been writing about different identities as a journalist for many years. I've been doing a lot of research as a creative writer in this topic. I thought it was pretty good. I shared it with, we sold it a year and a half later. I'm doing the edits with my editor. And I had been working on writing an identity, not your own. And when I received the edits, I didn't have any like big issues in terms of the character from the editor's viewpoint. However, because it was in my head, I was like, okay, maybe I didn't get everything right. I didn't go through this with a fine tooth comb in the way that I would do absolutely, absolutely do now. And so I basically what I ended up doing is kind of doing what is in the editing checklist in my book. I would focus on every single character of every single different identity. And I was like, okay, this editing round is just on them. And then I would go on to the next character. And then I would go, okay, now this whole editing round is on dialect and accent and dialogue. We're going to focus on everybody's. And I'm going to really look at, if I have them speak like this, does this say something about their character or about that identity? And I went through so many edits. Um, Within it, I think I had about a month or 2 weeks to a month on the first round. And I had about 2 weeks to a month on the second round with my editor. I did have a sensitivity reader, which was fantastic. And they gave a little bit of feedback. Um, but really, I was combing through things in a way that I had never done before. Didn't, I did find stuff that I wasn't very proud of, or I didn't want going out in the world, or that I didn't intentionally mean to write in the book. And I had to rethink about my characters, how they interact with each other. If they say this or do this, does this say this about this identity? And it was very stressful. And I don't want other writers to do that or to have experience in it. I would have liked to kind of approach the book with having already written this nonfiction book that is out in the world. And but I've written the book for you, and hopefully it could help writers and editors to kind of like approach it in a way that it doesn't have them scrambling at the very end before their book comes out to make sure they get everything right.
Yeah, editing can be really stressful, but it's also wonderful because you get a chance. I mean, what a gift that you had the time and the chance to, even if it was compressed, to make your book better, even and
Absolutely.
something that you're happier with to have out in the world.
Yeah, like, and there were moments where I was talking with different editors, and we're like, "Oh, this scene, there's nothing." that I think people could have said was like discriminatory, but there's something off about it. Doesn't feel right. And they were like, maybe you should rewrite it. And I rewrote the scene and it worked so much better. It actually like gave a whole level to one of the characters that Roski ends up meeting. It gives them a whole different like angle that I hadn't written them. I hadn't approached them in the edits beforehand. And it was very exciting to kind of see how this like slightly changes the story or makes the character better or makes my main character reflect on how she behaves and thinks about other identities or how she perceives how her family reacted and behaved to her other identities. So it was really fun to kind of do that. And it was hard, but I'm so glad I had the opportunity to do it.
That's wonderful, and that book, again, that's called Half Outlaw. That's a great novel that you wrote, and today we've been talking about writing an identity not your own, a guide for creative writers, and if you're not a creative writer, I hope it's been educational for you too to see how much work and thought that writers do put into all their characters and just how much goes into it. Alex Templador, thank you so much for being here with us today. Where can people find you if they want to connect with you online or maybe, book one of your or attend one of your writing classes?
Yes. Go to my website, alextemblador.com. You can find a lot of information on there. I even include like discussions such as this on there so that people can hear about what I've said about writing an identity, not your own, or my other books. And you can see my events and classes that I teach. But I also have another website, writing an identity, not your own.com. I hope to continue to have this conversation to share my thoughts and perspectives or things that I learn in this whole process of writing this book on there through blogs and different media. So I'm hoping to grow that and continue to help people with this process. And it just won't be the book. And if you'd like to follow me on social media at Alex_Templador.
Wonderful. And we're actually doing a new thing this week. So that's the end of the show for regular people, but we have subscribers. So if you are subscribed to the podcast, to the premium thing at Apple Podcasts, or if you're a Grammar Palooza subscriber, we're going to continue the conversation. And Alex has this wild anecdote in the book about the book of reading that happened for the book The Help that came out a few years ago. So we're gonna continue talking about that. If you want to hear that, subscribe at Apple Podcasts, the premium part, or to Grammar Palooza, and we'll catch that. And the rest of you, like, thanks for listening.